Cabernet tends to be the sort of Errol Flynn of the grape varieties.
The most expensive beer in history.
People will turn around to me and say, I'm just making gin while I wait for my whiskey to get ready.
Because wine is an adventure.
Conventional winemakers who just condemn all natural wine as faulty.
The prestigious title of Sake Samurai.
Looking at whiskey in more of an artful culinary way.
They kind of look at it as a novelty more than anything. The guy from the rock bands is making wine.
This is the Drinks Adventures podcast. I'm James Atkinson, and this is the show where I speak to some of the world's most exciting producers of beer, wine and spirits and uncover trends and issues in the drinks industry today. Have you ever wondered why it is that the aromas of drinks often remind us of other things? People often scoff at the notion of wines being described as having notes of blackberry and sandalwood, or beers that smell of citrus and fresh herbs. But there's actually science underpinning some of these associations. Harold McGee is a world-renowned expert on the chemistry of food and drink. His latest book, Nosedive, is a field guide to the entire world of smell. It doesn't matter how weird or offensive a smell is, if you can name it, Harold smelt it. And he explains the science behind every imaginable smell in this accessible and entertaining guide. Harold joins us for this must-listen interview on the Drinks Adventures podcast, coming up right after this. Harold, thanks so much for taking the time to chat with us about your new book, Nosedive. You talk about the concept of smell echoes. Can you explain what this concept is and when it first occurred to you? Because it sounds like that's sort of inspired this book.
Well, so flavor is the part of food and drink, which I've been writing about for a long time. That's the part that has always interested me the most because it's the part that gives us the most pleasure. And eventually, it seemed to me we had learned enough about flavor to write a book about it. And so I began to look into that. And as I began to pay more attention to it, I began to notice these echoes. So Parmesan cheese, for example, when it's aged a couple of years, develops the aroma of pineapple. And I thought, that's it's really interesting. And I love Parmesan cheese partly for that reason. But why would old cow's milk end up smelling like a ripe tropical fruit? And then, the more you think about it, the more you pay attention, the more of these things you notice. Cucumbers and oysters and green tea and the ocean. And so it became clear to me eventually that in order to understand flavors, I would really have to understand the flavors of the world at large. And it was those echoes that led me in that direction.
Now, it's obviously something we see a lot, with the rise of beer, wine and spirits appreciation. We see brewers talking about their IPA beers that have, citrus or tropical fruit character, or in wine, it might be a Cabernet that has aromas of bay leaf. And your book really makes it clear that these aromas are not by accident. They're very much underpinned by science, aren't they?
Yeah, I think many people who read the wine literature without being themselves lovers of the wine literature think that it might be all very fanciful, to find these echoes of other things in wines. But in fact, wine tasters and people interested in spirits have long paid attention to these things. It's, what distinguishes wines one from the other. And the fact that we can now look at these wonderful liquids and pick them apart molecule by molecule and see exactly where those aromas come from helps us realize that the notes that people pick up are actually shared molecules, not just shared aromas. And they're real. They're not, made up by the subjectivity of tasters.
There is an element of subjectivity, though, in there as well, isn't there, as to how people actually are going to perceive those molecules personally?
That's right. Subjectivity is hugely important because we all have different apparatus for detecting smells and interpreting them and putting names to elusive notes and so on. That's definitely true. And that's why I kind of chose in the book not to talk so much about perception, but to try to focus on the objectivity. So what's out there to be perceived, whether or not at a given moment we happen to be paying attention or have the right receptors or have the right connections to make that connection.
Tell me about the smell of cat pee, because it's one of the unflattering characteristics that we hear of in some American hop varieties, for example, and also in Sauvignon Blanc wines.
That's right. So this is an example of a very peculiar and interesting echo. It turns out that cats, male cats, put molecules into their urine that help mark their territory. And it's a sulfur molecule, and it's long-lasting. It sticks around. And it turns out that that very same molecule is actually found in a variety of fruits, blackcurrant, but Sauvignon Blanc as well, and hops. It's not as clear in the case of the plants what those molecules are doing there. In the case of the cat, it's very clear. But it's an inescapable echo. You know, once you've smelled cat urine, then whenever you smell a wine or a beer that has that prominent note, that's going to be one of your references.
Why is it that aroma can be, so unappealing in one context, but appealing and enjoyable to some people in another?
Well, I think it has a lot to do with context and with strength. So in the case of cat pee, that's the main smell. Whereas in a beer or a wine, it's way down there in the details. With the wine or the beer has the quality of that particular beverage. And then this is just one facet of it, one element of it. And for people who enjoy savoring these things and, exploring them and finding as much as they can in them, it's actually rewarding to, pick out that note and recognize it and make sense of it. If all you do is detect it and are displeased by it, then that's not such a great outcome. But I think the more that one can kind of set aside the hedonic aspect, whether or not you find it pleasant, and just notice it as an interesting fact, an interesting aspect of that beverage, I think that adds ultimately to your enjoyment of that beverage.
Beer can be spoiled by exposure to light if it's stored in clean or green bottles, and this light-struck character, it's often described to people as being skunky. But we don't have skunks in Australia, so I've never quite known what that means. What happens when a beer gets light-struck, and why does it smell like skunk spray? And what does skunk spray smell like? It's a three-pronged question there.
Okay. Let me start with the skunk spray, because I get them in my backyard here in San Francisco.
Oh, wow.
And sometimes you can go out in the evening, just go for a walk along the street, and you know that a dog and a skunk have had a scuffle and the smell is still there in the air. It's very much acrid. It's sulfurous, but with a kind of knife edge to it. So it really, cuts into your olfactory sense in a way that something like, say, the sulfurousness of a cooked egg or even cat pee really doesn't. They're not aggressive in the same way. The smell of skunk is pretty aggressive. And it comes in beer from a reaction stimulated by ultraviolet light, making it through the bottle and into the beer, a reaction that involves riboflavin, which is a vitamin, of course, present in grains, present in beer, but also subject to being broken apart by high energy light like ultraviolet light from the sun or from fluorescent light bulbs. And so you end up with a non-volatile molecule, a molecule with no aroma whatsoever, being broken apart into pieces. And those pieces, some of them are very closely related to the spray that skunks use to defend themselves.
Wow. And in Chardonnay wines, another thing that I am interested in is we often see with wild ferment Chardonnays what people talk about as a struck match or a curry leaf aroma. What's happening there?
Yeah, that's been a fascinating one. And curry leaf, I have never heard that description before, but I have a curry plant, a curry tree in my backyard, and I love the leaves. And this is now giving me something to taste for when the next time I use those leaves, a Chardonnay note. But again, it's sulfur compounds that are responsible. Sulfur is one of these elements that, when it's present in a volatile molecule, gives it a je ne sais quoi, often not a very pleasant one, but sometimes very pleasant and very interesting. And so the struck flint quality in white wines is something that wine chemists have been on the trail of for decades. Some really important work was being done on that in France as long ago as the 1970s. And it also involves sulfur molecules of various kinds. The most interesting and recent wrinkle in that whole story is that flavor chemists at a flavor and fragrance company in Switzerland discovered that if you take two flint stones and strike them against each other and smell, the smell is very similar to the smell of Chardonnay or a Loire wine with that kind of character. And they found in the headspace above those two struck stones sulfur molecules that had never really been described in wine before that have that particular kind of burnt quality. So it turns out that it makes good sense to talk about a flinty, struck flint, struck match character in wines because those same molecules are present in the wines and in the air around two stones that have been hit against each other.
Fascinating. Well, I've also, been lucky enough to visit quite a few vineyards in my time and see the sort of makeup of the soil or the terroir. Might be maybe some limestone that you can see, and then taste the wines that come from those vineyards and be able to taste a mineral kind of quality, which I think a lot of people are attributing directly to the makeup of those rocks that are in the soil. But that's not the case, is it? That's something that's been disproven, and you talk about that in the book.
That's right. It's really interesting that descriptor, mineral or minerality, is a very recent one in the wine taster's lexicon. If you go back and read Émile Peynaud, the kind of dean of French wine biochemists back in the 1980s, that's not something that he recognized. So it's something that has, for reasons that I'm actually not sure about, come into prominence in the last few decades. And it turns out that, for a molecule to have an effect on our senses of taste or smell, of course, it has to come from the grape and from the wine. But it turns out that the minerals in soils are, very well known, very particular, aren't particularly mineral-like. They don't have an aroma themselves. And of course, once a grape absorbs nutrients from the soil it's growing in, it transforms them. It uses the ones that it needs and gets rid of the ones it doesn't need. So there isn't a direct line between the minerals of the soil and mineral quality in wine. Instead, it seems to be this kind of echoing of particular molecules that remind us of stoniness and soil and so on, but that are generated during the winemaking process, usually by a combination of the activity of the yeasts and the activity of the winemaker, who's adding, of course, some sulfur for a variety of reasons. And some of that sulfur can go into compounds that have a mineral character.
Now, are hops and grape varieties unique in terms of the sheer breadth of the aroma characters that they can exhibit because of the fact that they've been so extensively bred and propagated into new varieties over many years?
That's a good question, and I really don't know for a fact one way or the other. My guess is that the range of different flavors in grapes in wines, I think, is much greater than the range of different flavors in the grapes originally themselves. That same French biochemist, Émile Peynaud, said that wine tastes more like the fruit than the fruit does. So the fermentation process brings out nuances that you would never notice in the grapes themselves. In the case of hops, it might very well be, just as is true with Mediterranean herbs like thyme and basil, for which there are dozens of different varieties with flavor nuances of all kinds. It may be that hops belong in that category, where we really do get a tremendous range of different compounds creating different smells.
And, some of the other interesting and somewhat unpleasant aromas that we can get from hops are onion, garlic, body odor as well. Are we talking about sulfurs there once again?
Yes, indeed. In the case of onion and garlic, definitely. In the case of body odor, that can be, in some cases, sulfur compounds. In other cases, they're simple organic acids that are generated by microbes, our skin microbiome, the microbes that live on our skin and feed themselves on our skin. So it could be a combination of different molecules that go into the body odor malodor.
There's a lot of new aroma characteristics that we're seeing in wine now because of the rise of natural wine, as it's called. And I've noticed quite a few natural wines where I've opened them, and immediately upon opening, you get this smell that really reminds me of like the drain in a big city, when you kind of get that smell wafting out of the drain. Can you tell me what I might be picking up there?
Well, that's probably, again, what we would more generally call spoilage rather than fermentation. So it sounds like an uncontrolled fermentation where microbes other than Saccharomyces cerevisiae are involved in fermenting what's in the bottle, or what has gone into the bottle. It's difficult to know because those wines are so various. I kind of enjoy the adventure of opening those wines and trying them. And I've had some that are just as you describe. I've had some that to me taste more like cider than like wine. Some that are acetic, they've already begun turning into vinegar. Yeah. And sometimes I think you're getting a kind of a combination of all those outcomes all in the same bottle, which is interesting.
Are there any beverages now that you can't enjoy because you've spent so much time focusing in on these different molecules, and now you can't see past the unpleasantness of some of these characters?
Actually, no. I would say the reverse. Just as we were talking about the cat pee aroma in Sauvignon Blanc, for example, it can be fascinating to notice that it's there, and then to kind of ponder and savor the fact that it's there, and how nature is kind of unified in the sense that all living things are dependent on the same set of raw materials, and they sometimes generate very similar compounds for very different reasons and in very different contexts. One of my late discoveries in writing this book was Baijiu, and in particular, strong aroma Baijiu. And I had the chance to go to Sichuan and see it being made. And I don't know if you've given that a try, but it's it has an edge to it that can remind you of the sewer in the same way that you mentioned the natural wine sometimes can. And I can now understand that because the fermentation takes place in mud pits. And in fact, the mud that lines those pits is a prized aspect of the fermentation process for baijiu. And at first I thought, this is the strangest sort of thing. How can anyone enjoy this? But then I began to notice that riding on top of that is a really interesting fruity note. And it's the muddy note that actually provides the raw materials for the fruity one. And so I really enjoy sipping a baijiu and kind of going back and forth between those two aspects of it and, understanding how it is that out of a pit of mud, you can end up with something with such an interesting nuance.
You say in the book that when you have an evening dram of Lagavulin, which is, of course, the peated Islay Scotch whisky, you're actually savouring a touch of the ocean, its animals and weeds. What's actually happening in that scenario?
Well, so it turns out, if you step back and just kind of ask the question, why do things have the compositions and the volatile molecules and the smells that they do, if you go back far enough, then you begin to see the biosphere at large. And it turns out that there are certain peat beds in Scotland that are especially rich in bromine. And the reason for that is that bromine, which is mostly generated from the oceans, along with chlorine and iodine and things like that, the halogens, bromine is released from the ocean and then travels in clouds and storms and air currents and so on, and is eventually deposited on the Earth's surface as rain. And when that happens in peaty areas, it turns out that peat has a chemical composition that tends to grab onto the bromine and hang on to it and doesn't let it go. It acts like a kind of filter. So the water coming in from the rain is full of bromine from the ocean, and what comes out underneath has no bromine at all. It's all been trapped in the phenols of the peat. Then if that peat is used, it's dried and then used to fire, to kiln malt for the making of Scotch whiskey, it turns out that those bromophenols, the combination of bromine from the ocean and phenols from the peat, those have an aroma. Those are volatile, and traces of those actually end up in the distillate of the whiskey. And that's where that kind of shellfish, smoky shellfish, campfire on the beach note comes from in Lagavulin and a couple of other whiskeys from that area.
Fascinating. Now, one thing you also explore is some of the taints that can occur with wine production. One of them is Ladybug taint, which is not something I've really seen much of in Australia, but apparently it happens quite often in Burgundy, for example. Tell me what Ladybug taint actually tastes like and how it occurs.
Well, it tastes as though the wine has been made with some proportion of green capsicum peppers.
Right.
I wouldn't call it a fatal flaw, but it does begin to override the more subtle qualities that you can get in a wine. And I think that's the reason that people are intent on avoiding it as much as possible. That can be difficult, though, because, ladybugs are a very ecologically friendly way of controlling insect pests in vineyards. And of course, some of them will end up on the grapes and get pressed along with them. And that's when the taint comes. So the trick is going to be to, keep the ladybugs happy in the vineyards, but then find ways to avoid getting them into the press along with the grapes.
In the same section of the book, a kind of related taint that you talk about is something I am very familiar with, because here in Sydney's inner west, we have a bit of a problem with fruit flies, and it's quite common that I'll be having a beer or a wine and I'll see a fruit fly pop up in my glass. What is it about the wine or the alcoholic beverage that they're attracted to? And You actually make the point that they taint the beverage as well. So if you see them, you've got to get them out quickly.
That's right. Yeah. No, the relationship between fruit flies and alcohol is really fascinating, and it's only been in the last few years that we've begun to unpack it. So, fruit flies, of course, are attracted to fruits, and that's how they got their name. But it turns out, as they've been studied more and more, they're a wonderful model organism for biologists to study in order to understand basic animal behavior. The more fruit flies have been studied, the more it's become clear that, in fact, when they're attracted to fruit, it's almost always damaged fruit. And the signal that they're picking up on and that they're homing in on in order to find the fruit is actually alcohol and other volatiles being generated by yeasts. So it's alcohol and yeasts and Drosophila, the fruit fly, and fruit. They're this wonderful nexus of connection and mutual aid. In the case of the yeasts and the flies, the yeasts are very nutritious for the flies. Flies that eat yeasts end up transferring them all over the place so that they help disperse them. So it's this wonderful relationship, I guess, for everything but the fruit. And it turns out that when flies detect the alcohol and fruitiness in a beverage, a glass of beer or a glass of wine, and they go home in on that and end up struggling in the liquid. Female fruit flies are releasers of a particular volatile molecule, a pheromone, which helps attract males, that human beings can also detect, and they produce it in amounts large enough for us to notice them if one or two of them fall into a glass of wine. And it takes a few seconds for them to release that pheromone, just as they're struggling to survive. So you have a couple of seconds to get them out before they release it. Otherwise, you end up with this, again, not terribly unpleasant, but it definitely doesn't belong in your beverage.
And what does the flavor taste like, or aroma?
It's a kind of waxy aroma, so fatty, and a little bit of a fruity note to it, but not a fruit that you would recognize as belonging in a wine or a beer.
What's the strangest thing that you found yourself doing in researching this book, Harold?
Strangest thing.
Or strangest thing you found yourself smelling, I should say, rather than doing.
Well, I had come up with something for the doing. And so I would say the moment that I felt craziest was when I was flushing pieces of a durian fruit down the toilet in a hotel room in Singapore to hide the fact that I had smuggled it into the hotel.
Which, of course, is against, there's always signs in those hotels saying no durian.
Yes, yeah, or taxis or buses or anything. I mean, but I went off in search of durian in Singapore because that's the place to do it, and I found myself fascinated by them, and I wanted to continue the tasting. So I, triple wrapped it in plastic bags and then brought it back to the hotel and left it on the balcony while I went out to dinner. And when I came back, even though it was on the balcony, the smell was just overpowering. So I realized I was going to be in trouble if I didn't do something about it. And so I felt a little bit, like a drug smuggler, just got rid of it in the plumbing.
And what about smelling? Is there any other, really strange experiences that you had with smelling? Too many to mention.
Yeah, that's the thing. I'm on high alert at all times, and so good or bad, because in the book, it being a field guide, I wanted to cover as many different things as possible, and so good or bad, I feel obliged to go after it. There's a Scandinavian fish preparation called surströmming, which is herring that's been lightly salted, aged in barrels, and then put in cans. And, we're usually taught that if you're about to open a can of food and the can is swelling, that's a bad sign that there's probably botulism developing inside. And so just forget about that can. In the case of surströmming, you're looking for cans that have gone from, standard can shape to looking like a football. And the reason for that is that the herring ferments in the can. And of course, there's nowhere for those smells to go. They're completely trapped. And it's fish that's essentially being broken down in there. So when you open a can of surströmming, it's an unforgettable experience. I had to do it once. I'm not going to do it again.
I think I actually read that section of the book, and there was some anecdote in there about how sailors on ships miles away used to be able to smell the maturation process, and it would actually, entice them to come in and eat the fish.
Yeah, that's the story that the writer of that particular book told. He also said that when they opened the barrels on the docks in this port in Sweden, birds start dropping dead from the sky. So I'm taking it all with a grain of salt.
Well, Harold, it's been a fascinating chat. Congratulations on the book. It's an incredible achievement. And I really recommend that all my listeners go out and get hold of a copy. So thanks for your time.
Thank you very much, James. It's been great fun.
The Drinks Adventures podcast is produced by me, James Atkinson, with additional production and mixing by Dave Robertson. You can find complete transcripts, links, and other information on the show at drinksadventures.com.au. You can follow me on all social media platforms at by James Atkinson, like my Facebook page, James Atkinson Drinks Adventures, to be kept informed of podcast giveaways and other news about the show. The Drinks Adventures podcast needs your support as listeners. Please do us a favour and leave an honest review and rating for the podcast on iTunes or Stitcher. We love hearing your feedback, and it helps inform other people this is a show worth listening to. Or simply drop us a line at hello@drinksadventures.com.au.